Good day and welcome to HITL's webinar series. I'm Tess Valbuena, COO and Interim CEO of Humans in the Loop. For the benefit of those who are not familiar with our organization, we, Humans in the Loop, are an award-winning social enterprise with a social mission to help vulnerable communities and people affected by conflict gain digital skills and offer dignified job opportunities in the field of data annotation in conflict-affected regions. We are also passionate advocates of AI for good, helping make AI systems more diverse, bias-free, ethical, and inclusive, ensuring that we contribute to AI systems that make a broad social impact that benefit our society. Now, I'd like to start by extending a warm welcome to our guest speaker, Morgan Scheurman, and also thank everyone for joining us today. I'm going to give 1 or 2 minutes leeway for those who are still also trying to join us. But without further ado, I want to give a bit of a background or bio about our distinguished speaker. Morgan here has a wealth of research experience under his belt and has worked with the likes of Meta, Google, Microsoft, and Twitch on ethical AI and harm reduction research. He's also a visiting scholar of information science at the University of Colorado Boulder. Morgan also has a PhD in information science from the University of Colorado, where he was also a Microsoft Research PhD fellow. Currently, Morgan is a research scientist on Sony AI's ethics team, and he will talk about his studies on how worker identities shape data annotation practices and influence AI outcomes. We will gain invaluable insights and actionable strategies for enhancing worker engagement and productivity. Welcome, Morgan.
Thank you so much. Yeah, happy to be here.
Right. Before you kick off, let me just give a couple of more minutes, maybe just another minute. Give it a minute for others to join. I can see, yeah, the room is growing. So for those who have just joined us, thank you for being here. And I hope you find this webinar and the research of Morgan really interesting and insightful. All right, Morgan, I think we're ready for you.
Awesome. Thank you. Let me pull up the screen. All right. Is it good or?
It's perfect. Go ahead. Maybe change your, yeah, this
One
one's
more
better.
thing.
Fantastic.
Okay, so you can't see my notes, correct?
Absolutely. This is perfect.
Awesome. Okay, good. I'll let you tell me when to get started.
I think we're ready for you, Morgan. I think, yeah, we've got enough people in the room. Thank you.
Awesome, great. So thank you everyone for coming to this webinar. I'm going to be giving a talk on the work that I've done on how data workers' identities actually influence the outcomes or kind of subtly the outcomes of data work. So it's titled The Human Touch at Humans in the Loop. So unpacking the influence of humans in the loop and other data worker identities on AI. So Tess already kind of introduced me here, so I'm really gonna gloss over this pretty quickly. But I am currently a research scientist on Sony AI's AI ethics team. So we focus a lot, particularly on data ethics on the team. And prior to doing my PhD at University of Colorado Boulder, I also did my master's in human-centered computing at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So I know Tess kind of already went over this a little bit. I don't know if you also want to go kind of more in depth for this, but I can also just kind of breeze by this.
And go ahead, Morgan, feel free.
Awesome. So background kind of and context of the research. So I'll kind of give the background that I have coming into this research, as well as just kind of the general background. So I'm also building off research I've been doing for years in this space, kind of on identity ethics in AI. So I would say for me, my own positionality as being kind of identifying as part of the LGBTQ community has really led me down this path personally. So I also was kind of greatly shaped by the courses that I was taking in women and gender studies during my undergraduate degree, and how that kind of highlighted the intersections of gender-based discrimination and racial discrimination. So I've done a lot of work prior to this work on how gender and race in particular have been treated in computer vision AI systems, especially. So these systems that are trained kind of to classify visual information about images or about people. And so how those treatments have been historically problematic in the field of computer vision. So in this study, I really wanted to take a step back and also look at how these identity categories are even decided in AI systems. And so I also have some work kind of in tandem with this work, focused on kind of the, I guess, what would be the clients for a company like Humans in the Loop. So the people who are working at these tech companies, the engineers, the researchers, the product managers, and their kind of influence on these concepts. But I'm not going to get into that too much. I mean, we can talk about that if people want at the end. But let me go over kind of the academic literature motivating this work. So one, AI can be biased due to underlying data used to train it. So there's like a lot of work on how this can happen. But at the same time, that doesn't always mean there's a right or wrong way to create a data set. So for example, models which can perform well on cisgender men and women often still perform really poorly on trans men and trans women. This is some work that I did a couple of years ago, kind of showcasing this. And this is because the underlying data used to train the system has only a very specific subset or population of people in that data. And then people from different cultural communities have different expectations for how these systems should work. So there's some work from Senadol on whether workers from different cultural communities produce different ratings on the same data. And they did find that that was the case. Beyond finding that different communities do produce different rating labels, they also found that the algorithms then trained on these data sets perform dramatically differently. So how people's cultural sense of something like rating content can directly influence the outcomes of an algorithm and how it works. And then, as I said, clients also shape the outcomes of data in ways that data workers do not. So you can see kind of the work that I was just talking about that was recently published at CHI, the CHI 2024 conference on this. And then also Micheli and Posada have a bunch of work on how clients kind of shape the way that data workers can actually engage with the concepts in their work. So this is where the concept of positionality kind of comes into play. So the worldview that we as humans all hold due to the range of experiences and identities that shape us. So how you relate to your own gender, or how you've been kind of treated for your gender actually shapes the way that you go on to view the world and your experiences. So this means that it's important to understand how worker identity, experiences, and perspectives actually shape data sets. Understanding this would ideally allow data production teams like Humans in the Loop to be able to actively attend to the ways that their worker identities are influencing data work, and ideally be able to determine whether some workers are better suited for certain tasks or have a certain expertise that would be highly valuable. So different identities may help promote diversity and improve the fairness of data sets. Also, it should hopefully make it easier to document transparently about how identity is influencing the work or the potential impact of that on the work, and ideally improve training for data workers so that they might understand perspectives outside of their own experiences. So let's kind of get into the study design here. So I interviewed a total of 27 data workers, kind of globally distributed, and about how they made decisions in data labeling and collection practices. So some people were doing data labeling, some people were collecting data, some people did both of these things. And I talked to them about how their identities influence those decisions. So all of them worked on these projects that either was collecting data or annotating data involving human beings. And so they did projects for tasks like gender annotation, emotion annotation, collecting diverse, racially or geographically diverse face data, and even annotating things like clothing, which also had these cultural concepts attached to them. So the data workers that I interviewed were largely based in Central Asia, Western Asia, Southern Europe, and East Africa. And then the clients that they served were largely based in North America and Western Europe. Have like a map kind of showcasing this. So the dots are where the data workers that I interviewed were located. And then from there, you can kind of see how each data worker served clients in different regions. So you can kind of see like, for example, I think that kind of the easiest one to parse out is that there was a data worker in Russia who also served in Japan and United States and some places in Europe. And so when I was analyzing this data, I took what is called in HCI research an interpretivist approach. And so the idea is that I'm also interpreting the data as I collect it and analyze it. So I would continually analyze and go over this data as I was collecting it for months. It took about a year to finish this project. And as the themes emerged, I began writing these theoretical memos, kind of focused on how participants were expressing their positionalities. And largely, participants didn't refer to their own, like they didn't say, this is my positionality, right? So a lot of it was kind of implicit. Like we would talk about the decisions they were making, and they would say something like, well, as a woman, I didn't feel comfortable doing this. I'll get into some examples, but basically you can see in this diagram that I created kind of how there is this like layered lens through which I had to look at the data. So as a researcher, I have my own perspective and specific expertises coming in, and then I have to interpret participant positionality based on my data. And so they have their own perspective and expertise as a data worker that I have to interpret, right? And then they also have to interpret kind of the instructions within the artifacts that they're working with, the data. So overall, the data that I collected here was kind of interview data, but also observations of them walking me through how they do the labeling. And then kind of going over the key findings here. So I really wanted to look at how their positionality was influencing their data work. And generally the way that I found this emerging was through things like media influences. So people would often reference, interestingly, a lot of American media. So they had a certain familiarity with certain concepts like race or emotion through media. And then also having kind of a sociocultural familiarity with data concepts. So for example, some people would refer to something like having to annotate interview data of different types of people, kind of being able to understand the expressions or the way that people presented themselves more when they were from the same cultural context. So an example would be kind of in interview data that workers were labeling. Some workers expressed kind of understanding the Arabic context personally and kind of worrying about whether people would be implicitly discriminated against for certain things like talking too loud, which would not be viewed as problematic in an Arabic context, but might be viewed as aggressive or something like that in a context that's just not familiar to that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Sorry to interrupt, Morgan. Before we unpack your key findings, I'm also wanting to just maybe explore a little bit more in terms of your studies because I find it really interesting.
Yeah.
Obviously hearing it from a mind or a structure of a researcher is very, very different from all of us who have a different way or a different structure when it comes to working, because operations has a basic fundamentals, whereas research, you have to follow certain, and sometimes you have to, you know, pivot from your plans as well, depending on the initial results or preliminary findings and things like that. So if you don't mind, I just want to go back because you mentioned something really important, perhaps not just to you, but to me as well, and to us as an organization, because we also are a very diverse team, and we also are very big, and we promote diversity, inclusivity, and all that kind of stuff. And so I want to understand, perhaps, if you can just share a little bit about, I'm curious, if you don't mind, if you can share with us your personal, apart from the academic, your personal motivation to dedicate yourself to this research. Because I remember from the beginning of when you opened the research, you said, you know, your particular attachment to it is, being part of the community, of the LGBTQ community. That's what inspired you. But apart from that, and also academically, what was the motivation to dedicate yourself? And if you had a partner also, did you work with someone else doing this research? Can you tell us a little bit more about that, if you don't mind?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think it's weirdly difficult to understand like the kind of deeper motivation that might have led me down this specific path, because I think it was kind of like I guess in research you're often building off of things. So I guess initially when I first started research, I was kind of working with a PhD student, because I was a master's student at the time, on their research agenda, which was using computer vision for accessibility purposes. So I was working on this project kind of as a research assistant to the PhD student and the faculty. And the idea was to figure out how could computer vision help people who are blind know more visually about the people around them for safety purposes. And so things came up that were interesting, because it's like, okay, we obviously want to promote safety and like make people who are blind feel safe, but things that came up that were really interesting to me were things that would otherwise feel potentially biased. So people wanted to know things like, does this person have a lot of tattoos? And I thought, I mean, I have a lot of tattoos, right? And it's like, is the implicit assumption that a person with a lot of tattoos is more dangerous? Or they would want to know something like, is this person a very large man, or is it a small woman? And again, there's kind of like this idea of like, well, what does that mean? And obviously there are cultural reasons that I'll kind of get into here about why, yeah, that can be important to know. But I was interested in how would you train a system to recognize that? And so that's kind of what led me down the path of like, okay, what is the perspective of a totally different marginalized community? And so I started doing research specifically with transgender communities on computer vision. So like, how would they feel if a system was trained to classify gender? And I found that like, from their perspective, it was largely negative. They were like, I don't want this to happen. I don't want this kind of like simplistic view of gender to be encoded into systems, and then to also kind of police my gender in ways that I also experience with like society and politics. And so I guess I just kind of followed that path, and I kept doing work on gender that have also evolved into like, how does gender intersect with race? And by the time I got to like my dissertation work, which this is part of, I wanted to take a step back from like, okay, what are the outcomes of these systems, and look at how do these systems come to be? So gender and race and these kinds of concepts are not, they're not like a fact in the world, right? People have different perspectives about them. Different cultures have different perspectives about them. Different communities have different perspectives about them, and they shift over time. So you can especially think of race as a category is often very different historically in some contexts than it is now in terms of how
But also, just to add, I don't know if this came up in your studies as well, is that sometimes it's not even about just that social media or the society dictates their
yeah,
perspective, right?
yeah,
So, and people conform to that. They might
yeah.
not share it initially, but because everyone else is saying it, they kind of share the same view. Did
Yeah,
did that come up in your research?
I feel like implicitly it did. In terms of like, I have an example here kind of about it, but I don't go into super detail. But for example, many data workers I talk to would just be like, okay, like gender is super obvious, right? The only options are men and women. And they would say, like, in the cultural context I'm in, for example, women are the only ones who are wearing hijab. And so I know that's a woman, right? So I can label that super easily. In an American context, that might be much different because as at least I'm more familiar with America, right? Because that's my positional, that's where I'm from. And so there's a lot of discussion around like gender diversity and different ways of expressing yourself here. And so that's much different than other cultures where there are kind of like pretty predetermined rules, or that's not a major discussion point, and at least currently, right? And so I would think that a data worker in America who is familiar with like gender diversity or conversations around gender might not make that same assumption.
Yep, yep, makes sense. All right, I'll let you talk through your key findings because that's equally as important as the study design.
Awesome, thank you. So yeah, kind of rehashing this a little bit. So I saw different ways that positionality was influencing data work. So like I said, there was kind of media influences, something that I guess I can go a little more concretely into it, kind of revisiting it. One data worker, for example, said in annotating emotions, they recognized a lot of the celebrities in the data set they were asked to analyze. And so they kind of associate it. They were like, oh, I know that media. And so this is the emotion that I remember from the media. And that would be much different if the person hadn't seen the film or the television show and would just have to look at the face of the person and make that interpretation. And so there was this notion of like, again, like mostly American media and kind of like how is emotion portrayed in that media? Again, sociocultural familiarity with data concepts. So this is actually very similar to what I was just talking about with, like, for example, hijab as like an indicator of what a gender a person is. That is a very sociocultural familiarity where some people just outside of that cultural context wouldn't be familiar at all. Um, and then also perspectives clashed within the projects. And so people would have to talk to each other to learn other perspectives because I mean, this is just how we operate as humans. We all have our own perspectives. And then when we come into contact with someone who has a totally different opinion, we realize, oh, maybe it's not as obvious, or there's another interpretation for this. So this came up, for example, with clothing in one of the projects. So one of the data workers talked about annotating being asked to annotate blouses for like a Japanese client, and the way that he went about annotating blouses because he was from India was totally unexpected to them. So he didn't think of a blouse as kind of like I guess the client's expectation was it was more of like a silky shirt with like buttons or something like that. And then his idea of blouse was like a colorful kind of longer garment. And so again, two totally different perspectives that maybe these two parties would have never learned about if they didn't clash in the sense of like, okay, I annotated this, my client told me it was not correct, kind of learning from one another. I also saw kind of unintended outcomes when positionality wasn't attended to in these kinds of work. And so again, there are kind of these mistakes, quote unquote, or misunderstandings. I say mistakes, quote unquote, because in reality, it might be correct in one context and incorrect in another, right? And so another example of this was a person who'd been asked to annotate mailboxes on the road and was doing this for a Canadian client. And because there were a lot of like novelty mailboxes, so things like a fish, but it's a mailbox, she never saw this in the context that she was working from. Like people didn't have these mailboxes at all. And so she would make a lot of quote unquote mistakes that the client was like, this is a mailbox, but you didn't label it. And then these kind of implicit social biases kind of came up, people weren't aware of. I can kind of talk about that a little more with my examples in the next few slides. And then I also saw some unrepresentative and unethical data collection practices because of the navigations of someone's personal positionality. And I can also talk about that in a bit. So let me kind of jump into some of these examples. So in terms of sociocultural familiarity with data concepts, this one was really interesting because most of the data workers did view gender as very obvious, but there was one specific worker who is based in Kenya who didn't. And she said, for gender, I find it a bit tricky because some people are transgender and they don't perceive their transgender as another type of face. So they just put it as female, male. So that's what they consider most of the time in these projects. And so she was expressing kind of like this wariness or like nervousness to label people because she knew this community existed. She was familiar with them. And she didn't want to make those kinds of decisions, but often she would just tell her client, like, I don't know. And then the client would make the decision in the end. But she was one of the only participants in my study who was aware of the transgender community and like kind of perspectives from that lens. Whereas the majority of people probably weren't familiar with this community at all or just didn't think about it, or maybe they never met anyone like that. And so her own personal familiarity influenced the way she was kind of interpreting gender in the work and kind of making her feel a lot more wary and cautious about it. I also saw some implicit social biases. I saw kind of things particularly around gender and race here. So for example, this data worker said that women are mostly difficult to know which mood they are than men. So for example, we saw the disgust and fear expressions mostly in women, not in men. In women, it was a bit difficult to know which mood they are in. And this data worker was a man. And so there's kind of this underlying question of, maybe for him, it's more difficult to know the mood that women are in. But for women, it might not be, right? And so there's kind of this implicit social bias where he had a lot more difficulty labeling these images of women's emotions than he did for men. And maybe that it's hard to know how that might have persisted in the data. Maybe women were being labeled in a certain way more often from this data worker. I also saw data workers describe how they had a harder time annotating things like the eyes of Asian people than they did white people. And so these kinds of implicit social biases came up pretty often. And then I also saw kind of potentially unrepresentative data collection. And so one data worker who is doing data collection, kind of going out in the streets asking people for their face, like images of their face so that they could get diverse data from across the globe. She described it as more comfortable with women, but I think men are really nice too, like really available to help. And some of them were with their wives, so it was easier for me to communicate openly. But she did describe how she actually went out in the streets with an older woman neighbor because she was really nervous about going out by herself as a woman. And she also said she didn't tell her father she was doing this kind of work because he would be troubled by the idea of her kind of going out as a woman by herself to collect data. And so this kind of is reflective of broader social concerns in certain societies that women have interacting with strangers on the streets. And it's possible that this would then result in a specific data set that would be much different if it was collected by, for example, a man who was very comfortable going up to strangers in the street. So maybe she only approached people who seemed friendly or seemed nice, and she didn't approach other types of people because they seemed maybe too masculine or too, it's hard to know, right? But yeah, it kind of potentially really subtly influences the data set here. In terms of unethical data collection, there was a data worker who was also hired to kind of collect face data, and he was based in Kenya as well as the other worker I talked about. And he claimed that the project that he was doing for another client was his own personal project. And he said that he did that because that's how he would make people on the street believe him. Because if he said it was something that was international for an international client, he said they would have thought it was for a devil worshiping thing. And so he kind of described to me a couple times like cultural beliefs about capturing face, like pictures of faces in Kenya as kind of being seen as nefarious or potentially a devil worshiping practice. And he knew that personally in ways that I was totally unfamiliar with, right? And his clients probably had no idea about. But he knew how to navigate it, even though the way he navigated it was potentially unethical from the perspective of like consent. So even though they said, yeah, it's because it's for your personal project, I will give you my face data. It really wasn't, and so it was not really consensual. And so then their images probably went on to be used to train some system that they wouldn't have otherwise agreed to. But again, it was really interesting to me because he, from his positionality as being part of this culture, knew how to convince people to give their data up. But yeah, this is kind of another layer of if we want to do ethical data collection, like how can clients based in like the West, like in Europe and the US, actually know about these types of things? Okay, so that was all of my findings. I'm going to pause here for a second, Tess, if you want to have a little discussion, or I can keep moving forward.
No, I'm happy. It's just I find obviously those samples very interesting, and obviously from a researcher's perspective or experience per se, it's very different as to the challenges that we face as well when it comes to, let's say, let's do collection, for example, right? Data acquisition is always a tricky engagement, I would say, because like you said, and I cannot stress this enough, because there are a lot of outfits and clients out there who are just so very pushy about getting data collection projects without the proper due diligence or even like terms and conditions. And what are your regulations around privacy, and how do you store this data? How will you use this data, right? How will you protect the identity of the person sharing his data? There's not a lot of that going around. So which is why I am really happy that the EU AI Act is about to be set in place, because it may not be a perfect solution, or it may not address all of the challenges around it, but it will somehow regulate the whole practice, and introduce other policies in place that would somehow mitigate our concerns, and the concerns based of your research. So I'm happy to listen, unless we get an impromptu question with our viewers here. But otherwise, I'm happy to listen to the practical implications here. And you might have questions for me. I might have questions for you, but I'll let you continue your thought process.
Yeah, totally. I also think that's super important. I mean, this is focused on data workers, but a lot of this comes from the clients and how they kind of like, you know, what they're valuing the most, right? And so they might not even, a lot of clients might not even care whether the data is collected in a way that's truly ethical or not, right? So I think that's a great point. In terms of practical implications, again, this is mostly kind of focused on data workers, but I again think that we should bring clients into this, right? So we can try to have more explicit trainings that encourage discussions about positionality and bias, including around subjects like race and gender. I think that an organization like Humans in the Loop is unique in that your data workers actually get to have conversations with each other, right? But a lot of data workers that I talked to were working in silo entirely, and they could barely even they did generally never met other data workers, and so their training was pretty much just what their clients told them. And so again, how can we kind of, I think again, maybe this goes back to clients, like how do we encourage kind of more explicit training for data workers around things like bias when the clients kind of are the ones saying, well, this is what you need to know, go ahead and do it. So this kind of goes into the next implication, which clients should be encouraged to create guidelines with cultural context in mind. that lays out expectations and assumptions. So this is hard again because it's hard to know what you don't know. Like knowing that a blouse looks different in different contexts is difficult. But I think that clients can also do a better job of actually thinking about, from my cultural context, like what are my assumptions here? Where am I hiring my data workers? Maybe things are totally different. Maybe I should actually give instructions about what the category of Caucasian looks like. Another example that I saw in my data was that one of the data workers told me she was asked to label Caucasian and Hispanic, and she didn't know the difference between those two because she was based in like Central Asia. So she never saw Hispanic people really. Um, and so, but the guidelines she was given never said this is what different types of racial categories looked like. It was just, here's the category. And so a lot of the guidelines that data workers got never told them, this is how you label gender. This is how you label race. This is how you label, this is what's this cultural garb looks like. It's just kind of the categories and
Yeah, and
how.
I can even add to this, Morgan, because I'll use again data collection as our benchmark here, because we've had data collection engagements before where the guidelines, and again going back to the clients, because it all starts with them, right? How the project is going to be uh, carried out, and the rules around it, and the consensual, as you said, parameters around it. It all relies on the client. So one example that I could share, because you were talking about it, it just reminded me of this particular collection efforts that we did, where they wanted different ethnicities, right? And nowadays, like, it's easy to say, like, Caucasian, Southeast Asian, or Arabic. But then this other collection had skin tone as a criteria, right? Brown, yellow, white. Now, how do you classify brown to as an ethnicity? That can be Arabic. That can be, African American. It could be many different things. So it makes it really difficult if it's ambiguous. And also, it does not help with the learning of these people. As you said, some of them are not even familiar or are exposed to these kinds of society variables.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's very, very interesting how, and sometimes companies and clients and people who are introducing and developing AI models do not take this into account. They're just like, we just want this kind of data, and you just roll with it. But then and then they come back to you with like, yeah, we were not satisfied because it didn't hit the mark. But yeah, because it wasn't explicit, like it wasn't really clear, and
Yeah,
it makes it hard for the beneficiaries or the annotators in this case. Yeah, but I
yeah.
agree.
They also aren't even thinking, oh, I know what that looks like, right? Because I think for a lot of people, they're never taught to like think about that. Like how am I making that determination? So
Exactly.
they don't even know how to write it down. Like they're not thinking, oh, I need to actually write this out for people.
Yeah.
Um, and then also kind of considering how to distribute annotation for more diversity. So a lot of the teams can be homogenous. A lot of the annotation teams can be homogenous just based on their location. So certain locations are going to have kind of people from similar backgrounds potentially, or just the people who wind up doing this kind of work might have shared backgrounds. Um, so are there ways, again, I guess this is again kind of encouraging clients about distributing to a more diverse team. Okay, I do have a cat. And
Yeah.
uh,
We have an audience, which is
yeah.
good.
Um, so how can we get more diverse teams involved in annotating the same data? A lot of clients, for example, just hire whatever freelancer is available. Um, and it's not even necessarily considered, or they'll hire whatever freelancer is the cheapest, right? And so they're not necessarily considering their background as an important expertise they might bring to the table. Um, and then annotators are also not involved in the designer projects, and they generally don't have interaction with clients. And so, are there ways to think about appropriate mechanisms for annotators and data collectors to actually interact with the clients and provide feedback, because some of the workers I talked to they disagreed with the concepts that they were asked to annotate entirely. There was one worker who really hated doing work that was like labeling whether somebody was a good fit for a job. He thought it was a really bad idea to make a system that does this. And maybe he wouldn't be able to influence the client's perspective because they have a vision for their product. But being able to give that feedback is just not allowed, not available in many of the mechanisms. I think humans in the loop is so different compared to other organizations in the sense that workers not only get to talk with themselves, but they get to talk with their supervisors who can interface with the clients, right? And there is more of a team dynamic happening at Humans in the Loop that there is at a lot of other annotation companies, where it's just like, here's your task, you're doing this by yourself, you have no mechanisms for feedback, and you're the one who's punished if you don't finish it on time or you do something wrong. So I think a lot of this comes down to kind of like, as a whole, the annotation kind of business doesn't really center data workers. Again, this is different than Humans in the Loop that does center data workers, but the majority of kind of like for-profit making businesses or freelance platforms, like Amazon Mechanical Turk, they're not centering the data worker experience. And so a lot of the practical implications also come back to viewing data workers as knowledge workers. Like, they have specific knowledge and expertise that they can bring to projects, and they're not just a way for clients to automate cheap labor. So that's all the practical implications I have.
Yeah. I'm glad that that came up in your study, Morgan. And you're not just saying that just because, obviously we've collaborated, but I'm glad that your study showed that there is a difference. But I also want to highlight the difference because I think you mentioned Mechanical Turk and different other crowdsourcing platforms out there, and what separates them from an impact sourcing social enterprise like us. And I would like to harp on that a little bit, and also share with you what are some of the practical implementations based of these findings that we have done and we are doing, but we can definitely improve on. So I'll start by sharing that our training curriculum includes an ethical AI module. We actually have in the audience right now our one of our trainers and coordinator for this. So yeah, we have an ethical AI module, which is a compulsory for all of our annotators. It focuses on recognizing and mitigating racial and gender biases. We also create HITL specific annotation guidelines for each project. Obviously based on the client's scope and requirements as well. This is communicated by local supervisors on the ground in their native language, right? In the native language of the annotator. So that helps. Also, our operations team, which is also present in this webinar, and our QA teams are very diverse. They all come from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, ensuring that we have a broad range of perspectives as well when it comes to quality assurance and when it comes to reviewing the work and the quality of the work. However, and this is what I'm saying, there are still areas and still more ways that we can improve. For instance, we could include more explicit training on positionality and bias. Obviously, now that we've had our webinar and our conversation and the result of your research, we could take this into account. We could also encourage clients to create culturally contextualized guidelines. This is what we've been talking about from the get-go. Thirdly, we could also consider more diverse team distributions for annotation projects, although we're already kind of doing this, but we could, maybe double our efforts in doing that. And lastly, we could also involve the annotators in the project design and somehow a little bit of client interactions, because there's also a danger in doing that. So we're probably going to consider that where it's appropriate, right? So yeah, these are the things that we are doing and we can do and it still can improve on. Taking into account the results of your research and your findings as to how can we help, how can we contribute and make things better, and not just keep on raising the issue and not really doing anything about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think these are all great. Again, I think that Humans in the Loop is in a position where they can make these kinds of changes, where a lot of other kind of organizations that do annotation work are built completely differently, and these are literally not things that they're doing at all. Or a lot of the workers who I talk to who are just doing freelance work don't have an organization that can kind of advocate for them. And so they are risking totally losing the work or getting a really bad rating, for example, by
Yeah.
pushing back maybe a little bit on their clients. I
Yep.
am curious though, because I also want this to be a learning experience for me from your perspective. Like, I'm curious what you meant when you said some of the interactions with clients might be dangerous or not desirable. Like, what are those kinds of situations that researchers should be thinking about?
Okay, so for example, I mean, as you know, we work with different teams that are hosted by local and established NGOs in conflict affected regions. And more often than not, we have to protect the identity of these annotators, right? So we cannot really share and give them FaceTime with a client because otherwise, there won't be anonymity.
Yeah.
So that's one challenge. Sometimes also, and this is not really a big deal because as long as the client is comfortable and has signed off, having workers in a certain area. For example, as you know, there are countries that are embargoed from the U.S., right? So if a worker in Iraq is like really qualified and proficient in doing this project, whereas the client has an embargo in Iraq, then that kind of creates that conflict. But obviously we cannot breach our agreement, and we have to make sure that we only distribute the work or deploy the job to countries or regions that the clients are comfortable with and would allow us to. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges around it, but more importantly, it's protecting the identity of our beneficiaries is the most important thing, because more often than not, we don't even we need their consent, even just to get them to give us a quote, or get them into interviews and things like that. So we have to also respect their culture and their values and their principles, I guess. And yeah, and
Yeah,
so I
totally.
guess, yeah, go ahead. I was about to just open the room for Q&A because we've come to the last 12, 13 minutes of the webinar, and I think it's important that we touch on some of the questions that were already sent to us ahead of time. So if you don't mind, Morgan, I'll start with the first one. Can you perhaps just elaborate a little more on how the concept of positionality specifically influence the outcomes of your study on data workers, their decision-making processes?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess one thing that I want to say is that to me, positionality influences the outcomes of pretty much everything we do, right? So it's basically part of all of our lives. It's just not something that we explicitly think about. We're not like, oh yeah, from my positional perspective as, I don't know, an American who's white and has a PhD, like, yeah. But it is always influencing, like, for example, for me, how I think about things, right? So even when I'm deciding something mundane, like what to eat for dinner, my decision is being influenced kind of by my relationship with types of foods I'm familiar with, things like how healthy it is, how many calories it might have, my family, how much it's going to cost me. So all of these things, even in the most mundane decisions, are relevant, right? So positionality is always influencing us. And so basically the way that I've been influenced in my life and the people around me affects these kinds of decisions. And so in the case of like the outcomes of data workers on their decision-making processes, these things are always present. It's just not possible for us to really know what's happening. And so the goal of this was to really try to understand it, although it was admittedly quite difficult because it's very, even when I say what do you think about a concept of like identity? People are like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I struggled with this a lot when I was interviewing people who are working in tech. Like they're like, I don't know what that means. Like
Mm-hmm.
identity could be something from personally identifiable information, like an individual or a specific user, or it could be, a lot of people thought of it as demographics, right?
Yep.
So these concepts are really squishy. They're really hard to talk about because
Mm-hmm.
they're pretty implicit to human life.
Okay. Thank you. I believe we have a hand raised amongst our audience. So I can't see who raised the hand. Can you maybe tell us, our host Elena can
Yes,
maybe tell us?
it's me. I found the topic very, very interesting.
Hi,
And
Rosie.
yes, I'm the
Hi.
coordinator for Humans in the Loop. I raised my hand. I find the topic very interesting, and this led me into thinking that weird question: can training result in making the annotators biased? Have you
Yes,
ever had that? You,
I would say yes.
not, yeah.
I love this question though. I think it's a really interesting question because I think a lot of people don't talk about it. They don't think about it from that perspective. They think training will always improve the outcome. But really, something interesting to me was that it felt like, I think this is a type of bias, but sometimes it felt like because the clients are pretty much always based in like the United States and Canada, Western Europe, they're influencing the perspectives of people in a totally different culture and then telling them this is the correct answer for that. And so it's almost overriding their vision of their own culture. And so I saw that, for example, with that worker in Kenya who lied to get data. He kept describing his own culture as primitive and then talking about kind of the techno utopia of the West and how he wanted to become an engineer and move to the United States and all this stuff. And it was just really interesting to me that it is a form of bias, I think, to say one culture is correct and one culture is not correct. Um, and I think you can train workers to see the perspective of the client. So if the client says, this is what a blouse is, or this is what a Hispanic person looks like, you can then bias that person moving forward. Like, so I do think there's that influence. Like maybe somebody will say, okay, this is what I've taught that a Hispanic person looks like. And then they eventually meet somebody who doesn't look like that. Maybe they have darker skin or lighter skin. They then have this bias about this is the specific look that this type of person has. And so I do think training can bias people. I think describing things as right or wrong in annotation is the issue, because a lot of the times it's right for a specific context and a specific task is not necessarily right entirely. Like in the entire world, it's always right.
So the training, I'm being a training coordinator, and that's why I'm looking at this. Training can make them biased. I mean, we have to be careful when designing a training. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Absolutely, Rosie. Thank you. Thank you for asking, and we absolutely share that perspective as well. Because at the end of the day, it's the human involvement and human decision making that creates that reasoning behind the decisions that you make, right? When you're interpreting data or an image in front of you, right? So yes, absolutely, training can influence biases as well. So we got to be careful. All right, thank you for that question. So we can move on to the next question that we had earlier received. There's also a question about, do you have, no, what were some of the most striking differences in data labeling between workers from different cultural backgrounds as observed in your study?
Yeah, so I don't know about striking. I guess interesting to me. But I did think, I mean, I already talked about this. I thought it was really interesting that the majority of data workers thought of gender as kind of man and woman or male and female, but I had one worker in particular had very strong perspective that, and was really knowledgeable about transgender people and like queer communities in Kenya. And she was really worried about how they'd be treated by AI. And so most workers weren't thinking about that. And I think what was interesting to me is like, and it was really, I couldn't get at it. I like during the interview, again, some of these interviews were really hard to do. I couldn't get it why, like, where did this knowledge come from? Like, where is the concern coming from? And like, why are other workers not familiar with that? I just thought it was super interesting. And these types of things probably come up all the time where it's like one worker has a very particular perspective. I also saw kind of around like content moderation work culture was a major influence. So people who were asked to do labeling for things like nudity, like from when they were asked to do that, but they had a specific religious background, this was like they were like really uncomfortable with it. And again, it's a job, so I think there's a lot of negotiation where it's like, okay, how can I say
Yeah.
from my religious background, like I do not feel comfortable labeling nude images of women right now. And so that was really interesting because again, this is a common task that tech companies want to
Yeah.
outsource.
Yeah. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for that answer. And I'm going to go to the last one so I could also make room for your final thoughts and
Yeah.
before we wrap us up. So the last question is, given your experience, Morgan, with major tech companies, what are the most effective strategies for, you think, in your opinion, for mitigating biases in AI training data set?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that I think I know that my perspective is probably different than many perspectives at major tech companies. So my perspective is that I think bias is a pretty subjective notion. So one, how do you define bias? So we might define that in terms of representation bias. So we should have an equal representation of all of the subgroups within our data, and they should all be labeled correctly. Or do we mean performance bias? So we want to measure performance on some predetermined group. So like, for example, we want to ensure that African Americans are treated exactly the same as Caucasians within the data. But what about the groups we didn't measure performance for, or the ways we constructed those groups in the first place, which could have been done differently? So basically, I don't know that we can like fully remove bias as a concept because I think bias goes hand in hand with perspective because everything reflects certain values. And so other values are going to be excluded. And so to me, I think the best thing we can do is consider as many perspectives as possible. And then logistically, we can't label things in a million different ways necessarily, but we can explain in our data sets and our documentation of those data sets the decisions we made about inclusions and exclusions, right? And like, okay,
Yep.
maybe around the task. And we can
Yep.
basically talk about, we can try to harness the expertise of the people who are being labeled. So it'd probably be a good idea if you're labeling people who are, I don't know, in Iraq, let's say, since you brought that example up, maybe you should involve people who are actually based in Iraq in that labeling process. And
Yep.
so I think these are great ways to kind of mitigate bias in the sense of one, we can do our best, and two, we can be pretty explicit about we didn't cover everything. There's always going to be something that we missed or just couldn't do, or it's a trade-off we had to make.
Yeah. Makes perfect sense, and thank you for sharing that. And with that, if there are no other questions in the room, I'd like to give the last few minutes give the room to you, Morgan, for your final thoughts, and then we'll close the session altogether.
Thank you so much. So data workers, in my opinion, have a really unique expertise that clients do not. So many clients don't have expertise with the groups that they're hiring data workers to collect images of or to label. So I think we should really value the positional expertise of data workers, and we should be involving them in processes of creating and enforcing guidelines, opening up channels of communication between data workers and clients when it's safe to do so. And so, for example, that data worker who is concerned about transgender people, she told me she wasn't comfortable talking to her client. And so can we change the norms around this situation? If she'd been comfortable, perhaps transgender people wouldn't have been left out from that data set. And so I just really want to value data workers, like I said before, as knowledge workers, not as workers we can hire for really cheap and then outsource. And so that's kind of my final thought on the matter.
I'd say amen to that, Morgan. Yeah, also, that's a good call to action as well. And that's always the message from us, with me. And I share that with our Chief Impact Officer as well and our Director of the Foundation, Hester. And that's always our message, that these people are professionals. They have skills, they have qualifications. So yeah, don't just consider them as bottom of the food chain or something like that. So for my final thoughts, allow me to highlight the importance and benefits for me as well, because again, we're talking about your study focuses on the influence in humans, right? For me, I want to highlight the importance and benefits of plugging in a human in the loop in the AI life cycle for the following reasons. One, it's important because obviously it mitigates the bias. Humans can identify and correct biases in AI training data or algorithms before they even lead to a discriminatory or unfair outcome. Number two, including humans in the AI life cycle improves the explainability, because complex AI systems can also sometimes be opaque, and humans can help explain how the AI, how the model arrived at a decision, and therefore fostering that trust and transparency. Third, it also ensures ethical use because humans can act as a safeguard against unethical applications of AI, ensuring that it aligns with the company values and regulations. Number four, it also catches errors. Humans can identify and address, as you mentioned, in your study, it came up as well. Humans can help address errors or unexpected behavior in the model before it even causes serious problems. And then lastly, it provides context. Humans can bring the real world context and judgment to an AI decision, improving the overall effectiveness of the model. With that, Morgan, I want to thank you, and on behalf of my team, we thank you very much for your research, for collaborating with us, and for sharing your insightful findings and presentation with us today. We look forward to our next engagement, and to everyone in the room who joined us today. Thank you for being part of our webinar series, and we'd love to have you again next time. Morgan, would you like to close us off by bidding? I'm glad that your cat made an appearance, by the way.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. This was great. I'm happy to get to share this with you. I hope it's helpful. I hope people learn something interesting. And also feel free to reach out. I have my kind of Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, handle there, so you can reach out to me there if you want.
Fantastic. And thank you to Elena for putting this together, our sales and marketing manager, and to everyone. Have a good rest of the day, and looking forward to seeing you again next time. Thanks, Morgan.
Thank you. Bye.
Ciao.